Hello and welcome back, everybody, to our speaker series. This week we have with us Dr. Emily Bamforth with Ecosystem Jenga. Dr. Bamforth received her Bachelor of Science in Evolutionary Biology from the University of Alberta in 2005 and went on to do a master's on the Precambrian invertebrates at Queen's University with Dr. Guy Narbonne. In 2008, she did her PhD at McGill University under supervision of Dr. Hans Larsen on pre-extinction biodiversity trends immediately prior to the KPG extinction in Saskatchewan, our next door province in Canada. In 2014, she started work as a researcher and curatorial assistant at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. And then in 2022, accepted the position of museum curator at the Philip Currie Dinosaur Museum here in Alberta. She's been an adjunct professor with the University of Saskatchewan Geology Department since 2021. She's published numerous papers and conference abstracts on Ediacaran and Cretaceous paleontology, and in 2019 was the recipient of the Women of Distinction Award for Science. Her research focuses on Cretaceous paleoecology with a focus on dinosaurs, microvertebrates, which we'll be talking about today, and paleobotany. She loves fieldwork and is outdoors, often accompanied by her trusty pooch, Aster. Emily, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So today, what I want to talk about is what I call ecosystem Jenga. What tiny fossils can tell us about a big, huge extinction? And this was work that I did primarily out of Saskatchewan when I worked for the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, but I'm also continuing it in Northern Alberta as well. So we're going to start this presentation about dinosaurs with a great picture of a rock. Now, this is not just any rock. This is a famous rock from Western Canada. And what makes it famous is its age. So the rocks below this thin white line are Mesozoic in age, or latest Cretaceous. So we denote that with a K. Of course, Cretaceous does start with a C, but so does Carboniferous. So we use a K to distinguish the two. So the rocks below are Mesozoic. The rocks above are Cenozoic, or the earliest Paleogene, denoted by the letters PG. So Mesozoic on the bottom, Cenozoic on the top, and between it, this thin white line known as the KPG boundary. The KPG boundary is significant because it definitively notes the end Cretaceous mass extinction event everywhere in the world where it's preserved. Now that thin white line is rich in a mineral called iridium. Now iridium is a mineral that's not often found on the surface of the Earth. It's not from the Earth, basically. So whenever we find it on the surface, we know that there's been an extraterrestrial influence. An extraterrestrial influence such as this. So before we go any further, I just want to define a couple of terms here. So the first term is the word bolide. A bolide is an extraterrestrial body that basically orbits the Earth, or basically orbits in outer space, can orbit any body. So these are things like meteorite or meteors, asteroids, comets, Superman. Basically, if it flies around in outer space, it's considered a bolide. A bolide impact is what happens when those bolide bodies enter the Earth's atmosphere and impact the surface of the Earth. And therefore, an impact structure is the hole or the crater that is left on the surface of the planet by that bolide impact. Now, when we talk about the dinosaur mass extinction, we often talk about a meteor. The correct term would actually be meteorite, which is what happens when a meteor enters the Earth's atmosphere. So it's sometimes called the meteorite impact. However, we're not entirely sure that what hit the Earth was a meteorite and not, say, an asteroid or a comet. Therefore, we refer to it as a bolide impact. So it was a bolide impact that's associated with the end Cretaceous mass extinction. Now, the KPG boundary, as I mentioned, a hugely significant geologic feature in paleontology. This image that you see on the right there is the KPG boundary as it's preserved in southwest Saskatchewan, which is one of the best places in Canada to look at it. It is thought to represent fallout from that bolide impact event. So basically, the bolide hit the Earth, threw up a whole bunch of dust and other ejecta, which eventually settled down onto the planet as a thin white layer rich in iridium. The KPG boundary is the only one of Earth's mass extinctions where you can actually go and put your finger on the place in the rock where it happened. You can say, it happened here. The KPG boundary is the only extinction you can do that, and therefore it is really, really important for our understanding of how mass extinctions work, because we have the timing down so fine. So the Cretaceous mass extinction, as many of you are familiar with, is the last of Earth's big 5 mass extinctions. Well, I shouldn't say last. We are currently in a 6th extinction. It's the last one in the geologic past. And it's dated to about 66.04 million years ago. The most famous victims of the extinction, of course, are the non-avian dinosaurs, the marine reptiles, and the pterosaurs. However, this extinction also took out about 65% of plant and animal life on the planet. It was a very bad day on planet Earth, but ultimately good for us, because if that extinction hadn't happened, we as humans almost certainly would not have evolved. The extinction is definitively linked to a gigantic crater in the Yucatan Peninsula of Mexico called the Chicxulub Impact Crater. This is a crater that is 180 kilometers across. So the disappearance of the dinosaurs and all of the associated animals and the crater are linked temporally, almost exactly linked temporally, which suggests causality. So the Cretaceous mass extinction, there's been a debate going on for the last 2 or 3 decades. This debate largely centers around the question of whether the extinction was gradual and the meteorite impact, the bolide impact was kind of the nail in the coffin, or whether the bolide impact was the definitive cause of the extinction. So that's the first question that people have been asking for a couple of decades. Was the bolide impact the absolute cause, or was it the nail in the coffin for an ongoing gradual extinction? So I think as a paleontological community now, we're starting to lean more towards it being a catastrophic extinction. That was the bolide impact being the absolute cause. So that's one of the questions that we can kind of answer when we look at the Cretaceous mass extinction. But there's a second question that's a little less well understood. And that is, what was it about the KPG bolide impact that caused an extinction? And I don't mean the factors, like we're talking about the bolide impact, the tsunamis, earthquakes, firestorms, acid rain, all of those terrible things that happened the day that the meteorite hit or the bolide hit. I don't mean in that sense. I mean, why did this bolide impact cause an extinction when other bolide impacts throughout Earth's history have not caused extinctions? So let's take a little closer look at that question. So this is a map that shows you all of the global bolide events between 1994 and 2003. And as you can see, there's quite a lot of them. There's more than you would expect, arguably. Fortunately for us here on planet Earth, we have an atmosphere. And our atmosphere makes most of those bolides that enter into the range of the Earth kind of burn up, disintegrate before they can impact the Earth's surface. But a lot of them do, if you look at this map. Fortunately, most of them are quite small. So they fall as meteorites. People go out, like to hunt them, like to collect them. They're worth a lot of money. But for the most part, the meteorites that hit planet Earth today are pretty small, thanks to our atmosphere. But it happens more often than you would think. However, if we go back in geologic history, there are a number of bolide impacts that were significantly huge. So this map basically shows you some of the significant bolide impact structures on Earth's surface. So the size of those circles represents the size of the impact. And the color, if you can see the color there, that represents the time period, the geologic time period that impact structure happened. So with the red arrow there on the left, you can see the KPG impact structures indicated. It's one of the biggest, for sure. It's one of the biggest impact structures we know of. But it is not the biggest, nor is it even, there are other impact structures that are a comparable size if you look at that map. You know, there's some in Antarctica, there's South America, Australia, Siberia. These are all significantly huge bolide impacts. Some of which happened during the Phanerozoic, during the time where there was big life like plants and animals. However, the only significant impact structure that is linked to a mass extinction is the KPG structure. And we can ask, why is that? What was it about the ecosystems or the environment in the Cretaceous that made those ecosystems vulnerable to extinction by a bolide impact. And just before I leave this slide here, I just want to point out a little bit of fun Canadiana. Canada has more bolide impact structures than any other country in the world. Don't know why, maybe something to be proud of as a Canadian. Bolide impacts really like this country for some reason. So those are the two questions we can ask. What was the ultimate cause of the extinction? Was it the asteroid, or was it the nail in the coffin? And what was it about the bolide impact that drove the extinction? So to answer these questions, these are all paleoecological questions. They have to do with the ecology of the time. And we can answer these big questions by using really small fossils. So paleoecology is a very important field of paleontology. Most of the time when people see dinosaurs, this is kind of in the context that, the general public kind of see them in. They see them in museums as skeletons or maybe fleshed out models. And it kind of makes it look like dinosaurs lived in this ecological void. However, we know that's not true. Ecosystems, like all animals today, were part of complex ecosystems. They interacted with their environments, with the plants, with the other animals, trophic structures, food webs. All of these factors were just as true in the late Cretaceous as they are today. So in order to understand the paleoecology of dinosaurs, we have to study the dinosaurs, but we have to study everything that lived with the dinosaurs as well. And when we're talking about extinction, all extinctions, regardless of their cause, are caused by ecosystem collapse. When ecosystems collapse, that's when we get extinctions. Throughout all of Earth's history, that's what happens. So in terms of the Cretaceous extinction, we can ask, what was it that happened to the relationships among the organisms and between organisms and their environments that caused the ecosystems to collapse at the end of the Cretaceous? This is basically just a different way of phrasing the question. What was it about the ecosystems that made them vulnerable to collapsing, that made the ecosystems vulnerable to extinction? So that's the question that we can sort of go into this presentation with. Now, I want to explain the work that I did. I want to take you to this amazing place in Southwest Saskatchewan called Grasslands National Park. If you ever get a chance to go, it is one of the most stunningly beautiful places on the planet. There is these vast exposures of badlands. And these badlands are latest Cretaceous and earliest Paleogene in age. The KPG boundary is preserved all the way through these badlands. These rocks, the Cretaceous rocks, are what's known as the Frenchman Formation. So those of you who are familiar with the Hell Creek Formation in Montana, the Frenchman Formation is the same thing. It just gets a different name because it crosses a geopolitical boundary. But the Upper Hell Creek Formation and the Frenchman Formation are the same formation. Above the extinction level, we call the Paleogene rocks are called the Ravenscraig Formation in Saskatchewan, but they're equivalent to the Paleogene rocks in Montana as well. So this was where I spent 6 years of my life looking at the microvertebrate fossils and what they could tell us about the end Cretaceous mass extinction. So if we go back about 66 million years ago, back to the very end of the Cretaceous period, this is what North America looked like. And you can see that Grasslands National Park was right on the edge of the receding Western Interior Sea. So believe it or not, Saskatchewan was at one time beachfront property. Now, these animals were not living right on the beach. They were a little bit inland, but not far from the coastline. So these are paleoecosystems that are still influenced by that Western Interior Sea. So Grasslands National Park, the Frenchman Formation, has the same famous dinosaurs, big three dinosaurs, as the Hell Creek Formation. So the most famous dinosaurs from this area are Triceratops pararsis, the youngest of the Triceratops species. Of course, our Tyrannosaurus rex. For the record, the largest T-Rex ever found was found in Saskatchewan, not in grasslands, but in the same province. And Edmontosaurus annectens. These are the three big dinosaurs from the area. However, they are by far not the only animals that were living in the late Cretaceous. Alongside these big dinosaurs, there are hundreds and hundreds of thousands of these really little fossils that represent the other vertebrate components of the ecosystem. So these are what are called microvertebrate fossils, and they're found in accumulations called microsites. So microsites are basically these accumulation of these small vertebrate fossils, often found in a concentrated area, usually in a stream bank or a channel deposit. And they represent the average diversity of an ecological community over a period of 10 to 100 years. So it's basically just a geologic snapshot. And microsites are fantastic for paleoecologists because they are diverse in the number of taxa they contain, but they're also super abundant in the number of fossils they have. So if you find a skeleton of a dinosaur, that's great. It tells you a lot about that one species, that one individual. But if you find a microsite, it can tell you about multiple species, all from one place. So this is just a very small sample of the microvertebrate fossils found in the Frenchman Formation in Grasslands National Park. The dinosaurs are represented in their teeth. So these are teeth from some of the small theropods up in the upper left corner there. The ornithischians, the hadrosaurs, and the ceratopsians are also represented, but we also get things like birds, crocodiles, champsosaurs, fish, turtles, frogs and salamanders, lizards, mammals, freshwater sharks, all of the animals that also shared that ecosystem with the dinosaurs. So microvertebrates are incredibly useful for paleoecology. So just a little note about studying microvertebrate sites. It can be a bit of a process. So there's two ways you can collect microsites. You can either get down on your hands and knees and crawl all over the place and pick up the little fossils on the surface. It's called surface collecting. You can also do what's called bulk sampling, which is basically where you take a shovel and a bag, you find the fossil horizon and you shovel dirt into your bag, you bring it back to your lab, dump it in water, let it soak for a few days, sift out that fine sand and sediment, and then with a fine tooth comb, pick out all of those tiny, tiny fossils. So once that sorting is done, you can identify them, label and catalog them, and then they usually go into museum collections. The specimens from Grasslands National Park are currently curated at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum. And then you can take all of that data and put it into a database, and you can study the fossils. You can study the biodiversity trends using statistics. So for my study, I collected 42 microsites from Grasslands National Park that represented approximately 12,000 fossils, and which represented about 62 paleospecies. And that in total was about 1,400 hours of work from the collecting through the identification to the databasing. So it's a lot of work, but it is so worth it because of the information that you get out of it. So just switching gears a little bit, I want to talk a little bit more about where these microsites are found. So this is a map that shows you the spatial distribution of the microsites in Grasslands National Park. So that's basically just latitude and longitude. And you can see each one of those dots is a different fossil site. And they're clustered, of course, in the exposures of badlands. So where you see a cluster of sites, that's a badland exposure. So you can see that there's a lot of them. I didn't include all of these microsites in my study. I had to kind of high grade a little bit. But this just kind of shows you the spatial distribution. Again, that scale in the corner is about 500 meters. So we're looking at an area, maybe about 2 or 3 square kilometers. But these sites are also distributed across a stratigraphic or a temporal range as well. So this shows you, again, that latitude and longitude to give you the spatial spread, but now I've included the elevation to show you how the sites are distributed in a stratigraphic range as well. So one of the challenges with this project was understanding how to tell geologic time. So anyone that has worked in a fluvial deltaic environment, that's basically an environment that includes rivers and streams, knows that there are problems in using elevation to tell time, because a site that is further up is not necessarily younger than a site that is further down, because you have these complicated cross-bedding relationships. So my first task was to take this stratigraphic distribution of sites, divide it up into temporally discrete units, and then compare diversity across the time units. So this basically involved a lot of stratigraphic mapping. This was kind of the first 2 years of the work that I did out there was basically just mapping sections. trying to understand the stratigraphic units that were uniform kind of across all of the sites that I was looking at. So I mapped all these sections, and using this data, I came up with a composite stratigraphic section, which looks like that on the left. And the stratigraphic section, the composite section, kind of revealed that there was an alternation or packages of mudstone and sandstone rocks. There'd be a mudstone and a sandstone, and then there'd be another mudstone and a sandstone, and then there'd be another mudstone and a sandstone. So it was cyclical. And what I was able to do was to define each of those cycles, each of those units as a time unit. So for example, on the graph on the left, that red sandstone unit 1, that's the unit that's closest to the extinction boundary. Down at the bottom there in the dark green, mudstone unit 3, that's the oldest unit. So you can see that there's an alternation between the mudstones and the sandstones. And that was how I defined time in the study. You might ask, why is there this alternation between mudstone and sandstone cycling in the Frenchman Formation? This basically has to do with a stratigraphic concept, sedimentological concept called accommodation space. Basically, it just means how much space there is in order for sediment to accumulate. So generally speaking, the sandstones represent more river environments. The mudstones represent more swampy environments. But again, the important thing is that there is this alternation between mudstones and sandstones throughout the unit. And again, that was how I defined geologic time in this study. Also from that detailed stratigraphic study, I was able to determine what the paleo environment was like. So on the left there, that's what Grasslands National Park looks like today. It's very warm, very wet. It's pretty arid. It's a little like Dinosaur Provincial Park. Very cold in the winter, as you can imagine, continental climate. But back in the latest Cretaceous period, the environment looked very different. So this was a painting by Marlon Jansen to show you kind of what late Cretaceous Saskatchewan would have looked like. So it would have been very warm, very wet, heavily forested, lots of these big kind of giant redwood forests, really diverse understory. And this is one thing that the fossil plants are really great for. Fossil plants are one thing that I really love. And it's because they are so good about telling you about the paleo ecosystem. So we have these Cretaceous forests dominated by these giant redwoods and swamp cypress trees with a really dense, diverse understory of flowering plants, ferns, cycads, mosses, things like that. So we're a really great place to be a dinosaur, basically. Now, as I was studying the plant fossil record, I came across something that was really unusual. And this was something that I totally didn't expect to find. This is one of those great kind of moments in paleontology where you find something without expecting to. So I was looking at two different paleofloral sites. One was from Grasslands National Park. The other was from a place called Chambry Coulee, just outside the park. And the paleofloral site from Chambry Coulee looked like a classical late Cretaceous forest environment. There were the giant redwoods, there was the swamp cypress, there was this diverse understory of angiosperms, there were some cycads, there were some ginkgos. That looked normal to me. But when I looked at the site from Grasslands National Park, despite it being exactly the same age, there were some major differences. The biggest difference being that the site from Grasslands National Park entirely lacked gymnosperms. It had none of those conifers, none of those big redwoods or cypress. And that was really weird. That is supremely weird for a late Cretaceous forest. And even the angiosperms, the flowering plants, were largely different from the one in Chambry Coulee. So this really stumped me. Couldn't figure out why this was. So I actually went back to the site and discovered that the site in Grasslands National Park was full of these little black specks that looked a little like coal, but if you look at them under a microscope, you can actually tell they're fossil charcoal, what's called inertinite. And inertinite is actually pretty common in late Cretaceous deposits. And why is it common? Well, it's common because in late Cretaceous North America, there were a lot of forest fires. So the prevalence of forest fires has been known in late Cretaceous deposits. Some people have speculated it's because there was a slightly elevated oxygen level at the time. So periodically, these big fires would have swept through these late Cretaceous forests. But what was really neat about the Grassland site and the Chambry Coulee site was that it represented ecological succession. So today, if you think of a forest that's disturbed by fire, if a forest fire goes through, the fire will destroy a lot of the vegetation. And the first plants to come back are what are called pioneer species. So these are things like fireweed. Fire, as the name suggests, fireweed is one of the first plants to come back after a fire disturbance. Then you start getting sort of low-growing forbs and some of the deciduous plants, and eventually you get the conifers growing back. And what we had found in grasslands and Chambly Coulee was 2 stages of ecological succession following a fire disturbance. So site 1, that was the one from Chambly Coulee, which looked like a classical late Cretaceous forest site. This was a mature forest. Where site 2, the one from Grasslands National Park, represented a site that had recently been disturbed by a forest fire, and that these angiosperms that were in the fossil record were the first plants coming back after a fire disturbance. So it was really neat to see that post-secondary ecological succession preserved in the fossil record. That was a really cool finding. And this also has implications for the biodiversity. So fire in general can actually influence biodiversity in 2 ways. There are some ecosystems that require fire. So if you think of things like lodgepole pine forests, lodgepole pines need fire in order to regenerate. So those ecosystems, those forests rely on fire to keep their biodiversity high. On the other hand, if you get fires that are too frequent or too intense, so for example, if you think of the fires in California right now, that can really negatively affect biodiversity. So fire can do a bunch of different things to paleobiodiversity, which is it's an important kind of consideration when we're thinking of factors that might have been stressing ecosystems in the late Cretaceous, was the size and the frequency of these forest fires. Now, this is the real reason why I really love fossil plants. I am in love with fossil leaves because they are so cool in terms of their paleoecological, their paleoenvironmental power. So these are examples of fossil leaves from the Frenchman Formation on the left there. And what fossil leaves can do is they can tell you very accurately about the paleoclimate. So the size and the shape of a leaf, what's called the leaf architecture, is really highly correlated to temperature and to precipitation. The reason for that being is that when you have a plant which has leaves, it has to offset water loss through evapotranspiration. That's basically the plant breathing. And it has to balance that with maximizing surface area for photosynthesis. And different plants do that in different ways, but the ways that plants do that is very highly correlated to temperature and to precipitation. So what you can do is you can take a fossil leaf assemblage like this one, you can map them for certain characteristics. So like size, the shape of the base, shape of the tip, the veination, if the edges of the leaves have teeth or not. You can take all of these characters, put them into a matrix, feed them into a program called the Climate Leaf Analysis Multivariate Program, or CLAMP, which does some statistical jujitsu, compares your fossil assemblage with modern assemblages, and then can return a very highly accurate paleoclimate estimate. And that is the true power of fossil leaves. So fortunately, the Frenchman Formation had a lot of fossil leaves, so we were able to do a paleoclimate analysis. And we were able to tell what the weather was like out there in the late Cretaceous. So the evidence was that the mean annual temperature was around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. Might seem a little on the cool side until you remember that the mean annual temperature in Saskatchewan today is 0 degrees. So it was a lot warmer. It was warm-tempered or subtropical. And we know it was also about 9 times wetter back in the Cretaceous than it was today. So it rained a lot. We also know that there was a very high seasonality. So despite there not being the incredible temperature latitude gradient that there is today, plants were still heavily influenced by what season it was. And we think that is linked to the photoperiod. So basically how light it was in the summer and how dark it was in the winter. So back in the Cretaceous, Saskatchewan was actually even further north than it is today. So it still would have had very dark winters, and that would have affected the plant's ability to photosynthesize. And so therefore the forests were still very seasonal. So generally very warm, very wet, again, a great place to be a dinosaur. But when we looked at the fossil soils, which are called paleosols, they can also tell you about these ancient climates. And the paleosols told this interesting story that throughout the Frenchman Formation, there were periods of prolonged drought. We don't know a lot about these droughts. We don't know how long they lasted or how severe they were, but we do know that they happened periodically. And of course, we know from modern ecosystems, the drought can be a major stressor of ecosystems. So that was an interesting finding that we took into consideration when we were looking at drivers of the mass extinction. So basically, I took all of that information, the biodiversity from the microvertebrates, the climate information from the plants and the paleosols, and tried to put them all together to figure out kind of what was going on immediately prior to the mass extinction, to try and understand why the ecosystems might have been vulnerable to collapsing when the bolide impact hit. So this graph here, what's it basically showing you? So on the left there, that's the KPG boundary. As you go from left to right, you're going back in time. And those bars basically represent diversity. These is diversity of the microsites within those different time units. So the white bar there, that's raw data. The darker gray bars are what are called species estimators. It's basically taking the raw data and estimating how many species are missing. Because of course we know the fossil record is biased and doesn't preserve all the species that are there. The species estimator tries to take an educated guess and guess how many more species would be there if your samples were complete. So what you can see is that there is a little bit of a curve to the biodiversity. There's times where biodiversity was high, there's times when biodiversity was low. This is kind of just a different way of looking at the same data. So on the left there, that's that stratigraphic column that I created from all of those stratigraphic sections that I did. With all those time units, each different color is a different time unit. The graph in the middle there basically represents the diversity of each individual site, with on the left it's 0 and on the right is 40. So you can see that kind of biodiversity changes a little bit depending on which site you're on. The far right graph is basically the average per unit. So you can see generally overall, if you look at this graph, biodiversity appears to have been relatively stable throughout the formation, except for two major sudden drops, which are right at the base of the formation and right at the top of the formation. So these drops in diversity occur within a few meters of sediment. So that's no more than 100,000 years. And each represent a loss of about 50% of the diversity. So whatever happened here was significant. I should note that the drop in diversity at the top is correlated with what's called the 3-meter gap or the 10-foot gap. This has been noted not only in Saskatchewan, but also in the States as well, where just below the boundary, diversity seems to drop off. You seem to get fewer fossils. We are not sure if that is a true signature, if that's a biological signature, or whether that has something to do with taphonomy associated with the impact event itself. So that one we treat with a little bit of caution. The one at the base of the formation does seem to represent a big drop in diversity. But generally, with the exception of those two, biodiversity seems to be relatively stable throughout the formation. What was really interesting, though, is when we started to look at the independent vertebrate groups. So for example, if we were to separate the turtles from the fish, from the theropods, from the crocodiles, from the amphibians, from the birds, we can see that the biodiversity trends are actually different in these different groups. So again, on this graph, the left, that's the KPG boundary. As you go from left to right, you're going back in time. And you can see, for example, that the turtle diversity is doing something different than the crocodile diversity, which is doing something different than the theropod diversity. And this indicates that whatever is driving biodiversity trends is influencing different vertebrate groups in different ways, which kind of makes sense. That's what we see today. And what I thought was interesting about this data is if you look at the green, kind of the darker green curve there, that represents the amphibians, the frogs and the salamanders in the fossil record. And of all of the groups, they seem to have the most dramatic up and downs, which kind of fits with our understanding of amphibians as being kind of the canary in the coal mine for biodiversity change. They seem to be affected first and more severely than the other vertebrate groups. So this was an interesting finding, that biodiversity is not the same across the board. Different vertebrate groups respond differently to different stressors. So there were a few takes that we took out of this. One of the coolest things we found was that there was actually a turnover in the types of turtles we find throughout the formation. So the late Cretaceous was the heyday of turtle diversity. In Saskatchewan today, there are 2 known species of turtle. Back in the late Cretaceous, there were 16. It was a really, really great time to be a turtle for some reason. And turtle fossils are by far the most common fossil in the Frenchman Formation after kind of exploded dinosaur. So we basically separated the different types of turtles into their different families. And different families of turtles do different things throughout the formation. So for example, the most common type of turtle in the Frenchman Formation are the soft-shell turtles, or the trionychids. And the trionychids are common throughout the formation. Their diversity sort of goes up and down a little bit, but for the most part, they're generally common everywhere. Compare this to snapping turtles, or the Cylindridae, or another species called Compsines. These families of turtles are far more common at the top of the formation than they are at the bottom of the formation. And one of the things we noted was that both snapping turtles and Compsines are brackish water or salt tolerant species. So those are the turtles that are common at the top of the formation. At the bottom of the formation, we get a different type of turtle being common. So the baenids, which are the extinct pond turtles, and basilemes, which is this kind of like tortoise-like turtle, these are common at the bottom of the formation, but not at the top. These are also turtles that are not considered to be salt tolerant, which is interesting. So once we noticed the turnover in turtles, we started to look more closely at salt tolerant vertebrate species versus non-salt tolerant vertebrate species. And we actually noticed that there was another interesting trend. So in this graph, again, KPG boundary on the left, going back in time as you go towards the right, the blue bars there represent what are called coastal taxa. These are coastal taxa as they were defined by Don Brinkman in 1990. And the red bars represent so-called inland taxa. So we can kind of represent that as sort of like more salt-tolerant species versus less salt-tolerant species. So for example, of an inland taxa would be a salamander, for example. And as you can see, as we go towards the extinction, so from the right to the left, we start seeing more and more of these coastal taxa. It's an interesting observation. It kind of gels with what we find with the turtle, more salt-tolerant taxa, more coastal taxa. This is in contradiction. In contrast, what was thought to be known about the recession of the Western Interior Sea. It was thought that at the end of the Cretaceous, the Western Interior Sea was receding from the area. It was pulling off and going back into the States. This suggests that there was actually a little marine advance right at the end of the Frenchman Formation, at the end of the Cretaceous. A little tiny marine advance where the sea is coming slightly closer. The reason that's significant is that these are largely freshwater environments. If you have the sea coming back in, it's going to be stressing those ecosystems. So what does this all tell us? What does this all tell us about the mass extinction? So we know we have generally stable biodiversity, except for a few modern drops here and there. For the climate, we know we have periods of seasonal aridity of kind of various severity. We know we have fire influencing. We have kind of forest fires coming in of various severities. We have the turtle taxa turning over. We have an increase in marine taxa, suggesting that coastal taxa, meaning the ocean is coming a little closer. So what does all this tell us about the ecosystem right before the end Cretaceous mass extinction? So the way that I like to describe it is as a Jenga tower. So if you're familiar with the game Jenga, what you basically do is you take blocks and you build a tower. And then the idea is to pull blocks out of the tower without the tower collapsing. So if you imagine the ecosystem as a Jenga tower, it's stable, it's, shake the table a little bit and it's still standing. But then you think about, say, the increased frequency of forest fires, and you're pulling one of those little blocks out. The tower is still standing, still pretty solid, but it's a little less secure. And then you think of the increased forest fires. So it's pulling another little block out. And then you think of the seaway coming back and stressing those freshwater taxa. And you pull another block out. And then you think of those droughts, those periods of aridity, and you're pulling more and more of the blocks out of the Jenga tower. Long-term climate change, which was known to be happening in late Cretaceous, another block gets pulled out. So eventually you have your tower, your ecosystem tower, that is still standing. Biodiversity appears to be stable. Your tower is standing. But then if you have a big event, like, say, a giant bolide hitting the planet, that tower is unstable. It's not gonna, like, if you have an unstable Jenga tower and you shake the table, that tower is gonna fall down. So the same kind of thing happened at the end of the Cretaceous extinction, where you had these ecosystems that were intact, but they were not stable. They were vulnerable to extinction. So that's kind of another way of thinking about the Cretaceous mass extinction, why that bolide impact specifically caused the extinction while others didn't. Now, all of this is a neat story in the fossil record, but is a very important consideration for when we're thinking about extinction today. We are now in the midst of a sixth mass extinction, and this exact same thing is happening again. We have our ecosystems that are like Jenga towers, and more blocks are being pulled out. So you have things like invasive species, climate change, increased forest fires, sea level rise, and all of these factors are pulling blocks out of our ecosystem Jenga tower. And we can look to the Cretaceous mass extinction to understand how those factors influence extinctions, and eventually how these towers hopefully became rebuilt. And so with that, I would like to thank all of my colleagues, especially my PhD supervisor, Hans Larsen, and all of my colleagues at the Royal Saskatchewan Museum, as well as my colleagues at the Currie Museum in Wembley, Alberta, and at the University of Saskatchewan as well. So I've put my social media handle there, EL_Bamforth, and my email address too. And certainly, if you have questions, I would love to take them now, but also feel free to email me as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Emily. We do have a few questions. First up is Bill Bloss asking, during your study of microsites, did you find any new species?
Potentially. The thing with microvertebrates is that you don't often get the whole fossil. You often get like bits and pieces or chunks of them. So it's difficult to describe new species based on general microvertebrates. We did find a few new species for the area, though. Actually, several new species for the area. So first occurrences of various taxas for Saskatchewan. So that was kind of cool to find. But we didn't yet definitively find.
Exciting. Jeff asks, regarding the 3-meter gap approaching the KPG boundary, is the drop-off there possibly a manifestation of the Signor-Lipps effect approaching a datum line? Ooh, this gets technical, sorry. As well as taphonomic effect or an accurate reflection of biodiversity drop-off?
Yes, so good question. So the Signor-Lipps effect is basically saying that rare taxa in the fossil record, if a taxa is rare, it appears to disappear before more common taxa, just because of the chance of preservation is less for rare taxa. So it could be a Signor-Lipps effect that definitely has been evoked for the Cretaceous mass extinction in the past. And it definitely could be happening. I mean, there's nothing we can say to rule it out. The real question, I think, now with the 3-meter gap is that question of taphonomy. Like, was there something that had to do with the extinction itself? So, for example, acid rain. Like, if you had acid rain percolating through the sediment and dissolving everything out underneath it, you're also going to get just fewer specimens preserved because of that. same thing too, if you had tsunamis coming through the area and washing all the fossils away, so taphonomic effects like that affecting the 3 meter gap, I think, is kind of more the direction we're going now to explain it. But at this point, we can't rule out that it is Signor-Lipps effect or that it's biological. So there is still a lot of questions surrounding the prevalence of the 3 meter gap.
Cool. Another one from Jeff, a fish question. In the section with predominantly coastal taxa, what fish do you have?
So by far the most common fish is the Lepisosteus, the garfish. Across the board, gars are the most common. They become particularly prevalent towards the top. What other fish? Amids, the bowfin fish are also fairly common towards the top. We tend to find less of things like the osteoglossomorph, so things like coriops tend to become sort of less common towards the extinction. And we also see fewer of the freshwater sharks also towards the top of the towards the extinction as well. But that again could be Signor-Lipps effect. They're generally more rare than the other taxa.
Cool. I was wondering, because last week we were also talking about the KPG boundary with Elsa Panciroli, and we had a bit of an interesting thought experiment about, as we are currently in an extinction event, what are your thoughts on what will be the sort of victorious species or taxa after this current extinction, besides people, obviously?
Oh, it's a good question. I think generally the same taxa that survived the end Cretaceous extinction will probably survive this extinction. So that's things that are generalists, so animals that are able to eat a variety of different food sources. So rats, for example, things that are small. So generally, like things that are large and specialist tend to go extinct first. So things like tigers and lions, some of those big predators that only feed on a couple of different food sources. They're probably very prone to extinction. And anything that in the end Cretaceous mass extinction, anything that lived in water or underground tended to be better off. So things like crocodiles and champsosaurs. So we might expect the same thing for this extinction as well. It's hard to tell because the drivers of this extinction are very different than the ones for the late Cretaceous. But I would say in general, kind of anything that's generalist, that can eat a whole bunch of different things, or is able to find refugia really easily, will probably do better.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it was I think if you can burrow or something, yeah, and then it doesn't really matter that the world explodes above your head, right? Because you can just stay safe. Next week, we have Dr. Caroline Stromberg from the University of Washington with evolutions of grasses and grasslands. So we are staying a little bit in the paleobotany corner of things. And I think we have no further questions. So as Emily said, feel free to message her if you have any other questions. And I guess we could also just take it on Twitter if anybody saw our Twitter announcement. So yeah, and with that, thank you so much, Emily.
Yep, thank you.
And see everybody next week.